George Alessandria, who's going to talk about international trade. He runs the Rochester Center for the Global Economy. George.
Thanks, Peter. Appreciate it. Thanks for the kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming. I'm going to talk about the global economy and tariffs. Let me start with just the state of tariffs, and there's nothing on the screen because, actually, so I made my slides this morning. They're up to date as of 10 a.m. Things have been moving relatively quickly. So let me try to put, I'm going to take us through like many years of trade policy and bring up some issues related to what could be happening in the aggregate economy. It's just not a simple time, but it's a time we've been through many times in U.S. history. So where do we stand right now? Well, tariffs have risen from near historic lows. When I wrote these yesterday, Chinese tariffs were 145%. There were major exceptions. Our iPhones were not really getting tariffed by very much. And then we had a deal last night that took Chinese tariffs back down to 30%. Okay? On the flip side, the Chinese were tariffing American goods by 125%. That's now down to 10%. There's a bunch of other tariffs on steel, aluminum, autos. We had these Liberation Day tariffs, right? We saw the formula, tariffs from 10 to 100%. Those have mostly been put on pause, but there's a 10% tariff. And then we've seen large effects on markets, right? I don't know what happened today, right? Something happened. We can all retire a little earlier. Exchange rates and then the economy. So that's where we sort of are for now. One thing I want to talk about, though, is this could all be part of a major renegotiation. So when we kind of look at trade policy, the president has basically been given power to negotiate trade policy for about 100 years. Usually it's a very clear process where Congress gives them a mandate, has 5 years to do it, countries negotiate in a multilateral way, they come up with an agreement, and then they phase in these tariffs. It's usually like a 10, 12-year process. We've done this several times, but we haven't done it for 30 years. The whole global kind of renegotiation process has broken down. So maybe what we have right now is a push that might be get us over the hump of going towards closer trade. Now, I will say we've been at moments like this before when it looked like tariffs were kind of going up and going to stay up forever. So we had a trade embargo in China in 1950. We had all communist countries. We jacked up tariffs in 1951. There's the chicken tax, which still is in effect. You guys know that's why SUVs that come into the U.S. pay a 25% tariff from 1964. And then there's a Nixon tariff of 10% across the board in 1971. And then we know Reagan did some things with constraints on trade. So we've been through moments when it looked like the whole world trading system was going to fall apart. So, I think we don't want to overreact to what's happening. All right, so let me just put some perspective on how much trade has grown. This is just a graph of U.S. trade as a share of our consumption of goods. You can see in the 60s it was about 10%. It's up to about 40%, and we've not kind of grown since the Great Recession. Now, the main source of this growth, we think, is tariffs have fallen over time. And here's a series of U.S. tariffs. You can see tariffs are pretty low. They're about 2% before the first Trump tariffs. They shot up to about 3.5%. Most of that is on China. But then if you go back in time, there were these spikes in the past, right? This is the second spike in 76 is a Ford tax, and then in 71 is the Nixon surcharge. So right now we're looking at something that's going to push tariffs up, and we don't know if this is going to be something where we're going to stay up for good or if things are going to come right back down. My guess is the way the markets responded, people think we're going to come right back down. Here's a longer-term perspective of these tariffs. Just follow the blue line. I showed you 1960 on, but if we go back in time, tariffs were really, really high in the U.S. history. Up until, they sort of drifted down until the Civil War. With the Civil War, they shot up again. Why? You had to repay your debts, and the way we raised revenue was by tariffing goods. The federal government was relatively small. Things fell. They stayed relatively high, and then after right around World War I, we dropped tariffs again when we introduced the income tax. And then things went up again in 1920. We've been very fortunate having low tariffs for a long time, but there's a long history of kind of moving tariffs around in different ways. So the question is going to be, are we going to go back to something like this, or will we kind of continue going down closer and closer to zero? So let me just talk a little bit about how tariffs are going to affect the U.S. economy. Probably the most basic thing you hear people talk about is they're going to raise the price of goods, right? So we hear, suppose we look at electric vehicles coming from China. Biden puts 100% tariff on those last September. What's that going to do? Well, if the price of the good is, P, we're going to add 1 plus 1. It's going to double the price, right? How does that sort of work through our system? Well, there's a couple things that could happen. What we're trying to do is tilt demand away from Chinese goods, Chinese EVs in this case. And so a couple things could happen. If we're buying less Chinese things, the exchange rate, the dollar could appreciate, making all goods that didn't get tariffs cheaper. That's kind of what happened in 2018. So you can think we raised tariffs on a bunch of goods. Maybe that's going to depreciate the yuan, and then that's going to make it cheaper to buy iPhones or something like that. The other thing we could see is firms might change their markups. That's that change in P. All those things are going to kind of work through the system, and they're going to depend upon what happens with the rest of the economy, if the rest of the world retaliates or not. And then when we do that, we're going to shift away our purchases from these goods. And how much we shift away, we'll call that like something called the trade elasticity. And this thing's a really complicated object. And let me tell you a little bit about this. That's that epsilon. So what can happen? Well, in the short run, you guys know exactly what's going to happen. If I tell you tariffs are going to go up, what are we going to do? We're going to run out and buy cars, or we're going to import a bunch of stuff. That's what we're seeing happening, because inventory management decisions really dominate our short-run behavior. And so if we think tariffs are going to rise, stockpile. Bring imports into the country. What's that going to be? It's going to be like a sugar rush for the economy. And then once we get all this into the country, we'll have a little bit of a hangover, okay? Likewise, if we think the tariffs are going to fall, right, we have these 90-day pauses, maybe tariffs are going to go up more in the future, or maybe they can come down. Well, if tariffs are going to fall in the future, people are going to kind of hold off on buying things. We'll have a little bit of lull in economic activity. This is what we see all the time when we change tariffs, and we do this all the time with tariffs. And this is currently a key force that's affecting the economy and making it really hard to understand the state of the U.S. economy. So trade was up through March, more so for imports. So we kind of, Trump's goal was to reduce the trade deficit. It's exploded in the last 3 months because of these forces. It's not been fully captured in the inventory measures that we see in the data. I think Jim will maybe show us a picture about this. And actually, the economy has kind of picked up growth over time. So let me just show you these pictures. So this is a measure of the U.S. trade balance, exports minus imports. We've been running roughly at 5%. This is divided by sales. And then the vertical line is when Trump was elected. You can see it was roughly 5%. And then starting in December, January, February, March, this thing has widened tremendously by 3% of GDP, or 3% of my measured sales. That's much bigger, or roughly about the size of how much we kind of brought, the goods we brought in during COVID. This is a really big shock. Likewise, this line right here is how much trade we've brought in. Actually, tariffs, in anticipation of tariffs, people are buying a lot more foreign goods, just relatively more imports. So this stuff is kind of taking off. All right. We can drill down to individual countries and see what's happening. So this is what's happening to like all of U.S. imports. You kind of saw this picture. If we go to Europe, imports have exploded the last few months. And we have extra data on China going through to April, and we've seen things have just collapsed. They've fallen off. Part of this is because people stockpiled ahead of time, and now this is kind of the hangover part. All right, so trade is kind of telling us people are kind of reacting to these tariffs in advance. You can't just wait until the tariffs happen. Everyone's being proactive. And this is industrial production. This is a measure of how much we're producing. Industrial production was pretty flat, maybe drifting downwards. Then we've got the election line, and we've seen a big surge, okay? It's grown from about 2%. That's a pretty big boom. It's not forever, right? Again, we're all rushing out to get things before these taxes go into effect. But you see similar activity in Canada, Germany, lots of different countries. So this is going to make it hard to really understand the state of the economy at different moments in time. So that's kind of how the short run of tariffs are going to affect the economy. If we go to the long run, well, there's other margins that are operating. So think of some of you probably run businesses, and you're thinking about a supplier that you're getting an input from, and the tariff goes up, and you're thinking, it's 10% more expensive, but if it's only going to be for a couple weeks or a month or a year or 2 years, I'm not going to find a new supplier, or I'm not going to look for new customers. And so a lot of what our people's expectations are for how long these tariffs are going to be in place are going to really determine how the economy evolves. In the first Trump tariffs in 2018, people sort of didn't do that substitution. They didn't look for lots of new suppliers. And so what we saw was trade didn't really fall as much as you would have expected to. Only when Biden came into office and didn't lower those tariffs back to where they were before did people realize, oh no, these are kind of here to stay for a while. And so that's when we saw this substitution. But this pattern happens all the time. And actually, when we look at US-China trade, this has been the main feature since 1971 when we started trading with them again. So let me show you like a picture of how we've been the tariffs on China. So what is this? This is actually a funny picture. This is the median tariff, but the inverse of it. Why do I do the inverse? Well, this is basically telling me if I spend $1 on a good, how much money of that good do I actually get? So 0 means I spend $1, I don't get any of the good. $1 means I spend $1 and I get all of the good. The tariff is 0. All right, so now you have it. 1949, this measure, about 85%. 1950, the embargo is in place until 1971. Actually, you can't buy anything from China. What I learned from watching Forrest Gump is that the embargo was lifted in 71, Nixon, and then they basically got pretty high tariffs. That's why that number's kind of low. And then in 1980, we lowered the tariffs again. And then they were pretty low for a while. And then we have the Trump tariffs, Trump 1 tariffs that Biden kept in place. And then we have what's happened recently. So you can see, historically, kind of this inverse tariff is not as high as it's been, as low as it's been, if we go back in time. And that red dot is kind of the median inverse tariff that we had yesterday, and now I've put us back to where we are. So we have actually some experience with changes in trade policy on China. The 1981 was a big one. That was actually when we shifted from recognizing Taiwan to China. And so we can look at how people substituted away, and likewise, substituted towards Chinese goods, and we can look at how people substituted away in the first Trump tariffs. So here's something we call a trade elasticity. What this tells us is, given you change tariffs, how much do you change, how much goods you buy? So if you look at that, this is, 0s when we change tariffs. That first line is -3. So if I raise tariffs by 10%, we buy 30% less of the stuff in the first year. And then over time, we buy even less and less and less. Or if the tariffs go down, we buy more and more and more. So this whole path depends upon kind of the decisions that firms are making to find new suppliers, get better inputs, and go on from there. It's also depending upon how likely people think the tariffs are to stay in place. And so what we can see from understanding like the way that firms behave in trade markets and the way that this trade evolves is we can recover what people think were expectations at different moments in time. So let me show you for like the last Trump tariffs. All right, so let me tell you, this is a wild line. Look at the blue line right there. That blue line tells you, starting from 2015, where did people think tariffs on Chinese goods were going to go? Okay, they were pretty low, around 3%, but there was always a risk that we wouldn't be in good relations with them, and people expected them to go up eventually. When Trump came into office, initially we didn't see much action, and then in 2018 he raised the tariffs. That's that black line. The black line is kind of the path of tariffs up through 2024. And then the red line is what happened, what people thought based on behavior of where tariffs were going to go. So they went up, but people thought they were going to come right back down. He was trying to get a deal. And as time went on, this whole path has shifted out. And so now people were, at least through the election where we kind of finished estimating this, people thought tariffs were going to eventually come down, but the path of which they were going to come down has changed a lot over time. A lot of this is what goes into the decisions that firms are making to decide whether they trade more to get their inputs from China or sell things in the US. So let me take a step back, kind of took you through a little bit of history here. Now I want to just talk about why do countries use tariffs, right? There's really several arguments. The first is going to be that thing I talked about influencing the terms of trade. If we kind of shift demand away from foreign goods, we can kind of have the exchange rate appreciate. We get more stuff. This seems to be like a strong argument in the Trump administration. We can also raise revenue, and then we can adjust to balance of payments problems. You've heard so much about the trade deficit, okay? There's two other reasons, or I'd say more kind of less complicated reasons. One is this national security, and the other is you've got some friends you want to benefit, right? That's always the complicated one. That's the one where tariffs can become a problem because there's so many products you can put tariffs on, and that's one of the things we worry about. So let me go back to tariffs as revenue. So as I said already, tariffs were the main source of U.S. revenue until we had the income tax in 1913. Recent tariffs have raised more revenue, about $300 billion. Nothing to sneeze at, right? I mean, that's roughly the amount of student loan debt relief we gave the last 4 years. I just read that there was an extra $16 billion in revenue on tariffs this last month. And here's just a picture of the tariff rate and the share of tariff revenue. That's that black line. So if you go back to 1929, roughly share of revenue. So roughly 20% of federal revenue came from tariffs. That's been pretty low since government became big in the late 30s. And as the tariff rate has come down, that's the red line, actually tariff revenue has grown because there's a couple things going on. One is even though the rate falls, trade grows over time. We're in Santa Barbara, you guys know about the Laffer curve, right? There's gonna be an optimal tariff for raising revenue. And then that's that blue line, it's telling us trade's kind of grown a lot. And so the tax base has grown a lot. All right, so again, once we start thinking about tariffs as revenue, we need to think about if we have tariffs, can we cut some other taxes? And so we've been doing some work trying to understand that. So let me just tell you, if we look at our current tariff rates before, I don't know, a couple weeks ago, months ago, 6 weeks ago, let's say, the amount of revenue we could get from tariffs going into the future would be about 15% of GDP. Not a lot, but nothing to sneeze at. For comparison, corporate income tax, roughly 3 times that, okay? If we start thinking about tariffs as revenue, probably you could get up to another 20, 25%, 40%. And then what you do with that tariff revenue, you've got to think about, trading off those different distortions in the economy. I don't want to get too far. The key thing is what we do with that revenue. If we use it to subsidize investment, encourage people to go to work, the tariffs might not be as costly. If we give out a tariff dividend check, that's not very good because it's not going to create much incentive to work. And importantly, when we raise tariffs, a lot of that's going to fall on capital goods. And if we're thinking about one of the reasons why we're doing this is to build more infrastructure, improve the amount of capital we have in production, that's not going to work. A lot has been discussed about the trade balance as a reason to have tariffs in place. So the U.S. trade balance as a share of GDP has been roughly 3% for the last 15 years, maybe a little bit less than that. The consensus is that reflects good growth opportunities in the U.S. That's why people come here to work, people come here to invest. It also reflects poor savings by Americans, partly because they have good growth opportunities, but also reflects really a real strong desire to save in the rest of the world, partly because they don't have good growth opportunities. So if we look at China, which is a really fast-growing economy, it's sort of puzzling to us that we don't see China sucking in a lot of capital. So it has to be they're either forcing savings or they're kind of over-accumulating. So these forces are always operating in the economy. They're intermediated by how much trade we have. So a closed economy can't run surpluses or deficits. An open economy can. Tariffs can help in this adjustment. Obviously, if we go to no trade, there'll be no trade deficit. I don't think that's the outcome anyone's looking for, but there's certainly a margin that people can use. Let me just say these are really exciting times as a researcher. Creates a little bit of anxiety, I think. But we should have some perspective that we've been through this before and the economy has survived just fine. There's going to be some reallocation, most likely. It would be nice if this was connected to the whole fiscal process with Congress. Maybe even linking this tariff revenue to tax reform would be helpful. But it'll be interesting for a while, I think. So, thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks, George. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
What should tariffs be exactly? 0? What do you think tariffs should be as an economist? Thanks, George. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I don't think zero. I don't think zero.